Welcome to Understanding Camera Features Through Their Trade-Offs, aka you sure do talk a lot about sensor size, grain, exposure, depth of field, zooming in, highlight recovery, crop factor, and saving money and avoiding needless bulk. Note that this video, despite being quite long, was originally intended to cover more subject matter than it does, but there simply is not enough time to show that. So instead, this is Part 1, Important Considerations and an Introduction to Camera-Related Terms. Part 2 of 2 thus will not be shown, but if there is time, I will give you a preview of what's to come in that part. Introduction. Hi there, I'm Stacy Muller, as you might already know, and I'm here in part 1 of this video before the break to share with you some things about camera and lens systems that I hope you will find useful, especially for avoiding image quality problems where in most cases those are problems that can be attributed to limitations of a system, such as a system that produces too much unsightly grain for your taste. In other words, I hope to help you avoid making a mistake that many people, admittedly including myself, have made in choosing to use or buy what turned out to be the wrong camera system for the particular job we had in mind for the camera. Buying the wrong camera can, of course, be frustrating, and it's this sort of frustration that inspired me to write an as-yet unpublished ebook and to make this presentation, and perhaps eventually a version of this presentation that I can put on YouTube. There were some other sources of inspiration as well for me. One rather important source was some information that was very eye-opening for me, and which I first encountered already a few years ago through YouTube-based photo educator Tony Northrup. Not that I want to copycat anyone, mind you. I know that, unlike me, not everyone likes YouTubers like this, and I'll admit that some topics they cover can be a little clickbaity, and they can sometimes even be the cause of needless drama. Still, I think there are a few particularly excellent segments from a few of Tony's videos that probably introduces better than I can the reasons why at least some of the issues I want to address in this video presentation could be important to you. A lot of it has to do with how a number of camera companies at least used to mislead their potential customers in their advertising, and how something called crop factor can help consumers with that and with basically making an inexpensive and possibly compact camera and lens system work as well, at least in some important ways, as a more expensive and possibly bulkier system. This all has to do with what I think are the most important trade-offs of camera features. The trade-offs of a smaller type of imaging sensor in a camera, and perhaps lesser known, the trade-offs of a larger sensor. I propose to you in general that a great way to understand a camera and lens system is to understand the trade-offs of its various features. For instance, exposure settings have trade-offs. As one example of this, when you dial up an exposure control you likely know about called ISO, in order to make an underexposed image look correctly exposed, you increase the level of grain. I mention that example because of the importance of both proper exposure and the avoidance of too much grain. When you try to apply any exposure setting to your advantage, be it ISO, shutter speed, or aperture, it's good to understand any one or more potentially unwanted trade-offs for that. Getting back to the Tony Northrup videos, here's just a brief excerpt from one such video going back a few years now.
This is the Olympus Stylus 1. You can see in their marketing copy here, a screenshot of it, they brag that it's a 28 to 300 millimeter f2.8. And they show a shadow of what a 300 millimeter f2.8 full frame lens would look like, and then they show their tiny little camera. They're definitely implying that you'll get the same results. But the physical lens here is a 6 to 64 millimeter f2.8 lens. So it is actually an f2.8 lens. And they do tell you it's f2.8, but then they apply the crop factor to the focal length, and they associate those two things. But they're inseparable. You cannot apply the crop factor to the focal length and not apply it to the aperture, or you're overstating the capabilities of a lens and misleading consumers who are spending possibly thousands of dollars on your equipment. It's unethical and unfair, And it leads to disappointed people who don't get the results that they thought they were going to get, and perhaps don't fall in love with photography like the rest of us have. If you were to put this in equivalent terms, the lens itself would behave like a 28 to 300 millimeter f13 lens would on a full frame body. Again, that's total image noise in any given lighting situation and depth of field.
I acknowledge that there might be some here who already know this stuff and who have perhaps even seen the video segments. Still, I really want to share this with those who are less aware. Using crop factor, by the way, is not just limited to digital cameras. It can be applied to film cameras as well. But for the most part, I'll be talking about it in terms of digital cameras. Originally, I was not going to reveal the details of the smaller versus larger sensor trade-offs, or even get into any other trade-offs to camera features, until I first went through building a lot of basic foundation through presenting you with proper terms and concepts. On one hand, I don't want to lose anyone through a technical explanation that I might provide right now, but on the other hand, I don't want to lose anyone who is curious about this and who could understand it now by taking too much time to get to it. So here's what I'll do. I'm going to provide that explanation in a way that I hope you can understand, but also tell you to not worry if you do not fully understand it. You will hear me tell you that quite a bit throughout this presentation about certain things. Do not worry if you don't understand it, because if it is important to you, you likely will come to understand it as I explain it more in full. And if it's not important to you, well, no worries then either. I'll try to keep this fairly simple, even at risk of oversimplifying what I want to say. You'll likely understand at least a fair bit of this. Larger sensors contribute more than smaller sensors to grain mitigating low light performance, and for any specific image-based angle of view that we might want to achieve, they also contribute more to a shallow depth of field, which in turn contributes to background blur. While smaller sensors contribute more than larger sensors to making many of the camera and lens systems that are built around them to be compact, and to the ability to zoom in more as part of that compactness, much as taking a crop of the image from a larger sensor would, except with the added advantage in most, but not all, cases of providing higher pixel resolution than that cropped area. I want to make it clear, though, that this does not mean that the image resulting from a smaller sensor cannot in any situation do as well or better than an image resulting from a larger sensor for low light performance and shallow depth of field. The smaller sensor can do that well, so long as it is paired with, most importantly, the right lens, and somewhat importantly, the right grain-reducing electronics. There are many common situations where this is what is happening, and the smaller sensor-based camera outperforms the larger sensor-based camera. But if we are comparing two sizes of sensors, and in addition to keeping the angle of view the same, we are keeping the exposure settings the same, and the camera to subject focus distance the same, that's when the comparison is kept fair, and you'll indeed see a shallower focus from the larger sensor. The right lens is what makes the most difference. However, there is one very important limitation to note, which is that for some of the very smallest sensors, the right lens that such a sensor needs to meet certain demands is often just not available, and possibly even physically and optically impossible to be made for how low an f-stop we might want it to have, or in other words, how light transmissive we want the lens to be. I'll leave my explanation on larger versus smaller sensor trade-offs at that for now. Hopefully you understood a fair bit of it. By the way, you can expect that I'll be using quite a few snippets of media from the internet besides just the Northrop video to assist with my presentation. I suppose that's okay under the so-called fair use laws. Where I hope I'm adding value to these things is in the way I bring them together and in the order in which I present them. I'm sure most of you are familiar with what unsightly grain looks like in a photo or a video. Many of us have had to fight with this. For those of you who are already familiar with how lenses are often labeled with what's called a focal length and with what we might call a lowest achievable f-stop, and understand those technical camera-related terms and others like full-frame sensor, APS-C sensor, angle of view, and shallow depth of field, I want to briefly discuss something with you. And even if you don't understand those terms, feel free to see how much of my brief discussion you do understand. You might already know of a particular economical way to get a nice angle of view for portrait shots, similar to what an expensive full-frame camera body with an expensive f1.8 portrait lens gives you. That is, you can simply use an economical 50mm f1.8 lens matched with an economical camera body that has a smaller APS-C sensor to achieve the full-frame equivalent of either a 75mm or 80mm focal length in terms of angle of view, depending on which APS-C sensor you are using. We might even be happy if we could achieve the sort of image that a 75mm f1.8 lens gives us on a full-frame sensor, which is not that different than an 85mm f1.8 lens, although it should be noted that we are less likely to find a 75mm f1.8 lens than the more common 85mm f1.8 lens. I am now going to visually show you the differences between the sort of images these lenses can produce, particularly in terms of the background blur, by using a depth of field simulator app. We'll have a model stand 6 feet from the camera. That's 1.8 meters. We start with the popular 85mm f1.8 lens that I mentioned. Then we look at the result of the theoretical 75mm f1.8 lens. I'm using a roughly 30-degree angle of view here for the image, which I think works well for a portrait shot. Then we look at the result of the 50mm f1.8 lens on the APS-C sensor. The angle of view is, again, roughly 30 degrees. So let me ask you something. Now that we are getting a reasonably similar angle of view between the 75mm lens and the 50mm lens, are we getting a reasonably similar amount of background blur as well? Obviously, no, we are not. Relating to the difference in background blur, there is also a large difference in the depth of field for both lenses. The 50mm f1.8 lens is not giving us the full-frame equivalent f1.8 lens in terms of achieving the same or at least similar level of background blur through the same or at least similar shallow depth of field that we would want. I can tell you now that you could not expect as much mitigation of unsightly grain with the 50mm lens and APS-C sensor combination as you could from the full-frame setup. What you are getting instead of an f1.8 full-frame equivalent lens is basically a not quite as good f2.8 lens in equivalency. I'm not saying that that's not good enough. I'm just saying that you should be aware that you would be taking somewhat of a hit in the quality that you might want, and that the lens manufacturer is not likely going to warn you about that. If it was important for you to truly match the quality of the more expensive camera and lens system, you would need a 50mm f1.2 lens. A 50mm f1.2 lens at that lowest f-stop of f1.2 may or may not be as sharp as an 85mm f1.8 lens on a full-frame sensor that you might have been wanting. But then again, it might just be close enough. A 50mm f1.2 lens is also certain to be more expensive than the 50mm f1.8 lens, but then again, paired with an APS-C camera body, that system might still be significantly less than the full-frame system and possibly more compact. Save money and avoid needless bulk. I have a major concern in regards to how I should proceed with my presentation. I can't assume that all of you know the technical camera-related terms that I'll be using in my presentation or that the Northrop video segments use. The proper way to explain these terms with formal definitions and explanations of those definitions could take a fair bit of time and could get into some heady stuff that can be confusing. But I think there's a simpler way to explain at least a few terms that we will need to know fairly soon, and in a way that might give you a visual sense of the concepts behind them. Please feel free to have me pause the video if you have a question or if you've caught me on a major mistake I've made. Although, note that we are on limited time and that things will probably become more clear to you as we progress through the presentation. I at least want to get through the most important stuff I have to say first, while we're still fresh and in case we run out of time. I hope to teach you some advanced things, unless that is you already know those things, by first laying down the basic foundation of simpler things and building our way up, slowly if needed, and with a little entertainment at times to keep things from getting too dry. Hopefully there will be time for a Q&A after. I'm also open to criticism. That might even help my ebook. If that's to be a long conversation, though, perhaps defer it to an email to me, an address for which I'll provide at the end of the presentation, and here as well, stacymuller@yahoo.com. This video is broken up into two parts, one for prior to the break time and one for after. If the video is cut short, I might be able to provide an online version in full through an unlisted YouTube link. We actually have quite a few interesting things to talk about before we get to the Tony Northrop camera conspiracies that I think might also interest you. In the meantime, I think you'll find the next section to be quite interesting. On making a less expensive camera and lens system work, at least nearly, as well as a more expensive one. I'm going to show you some short parts of a video I found on YouTube that I found to be very interesting in terms of avoiding spending too much money on a digital camera and lens system, particularly when a less expensive system can work nearly as well as a more expensive one with a larger imaging sensor. I've edited the video down into a few key segments. One camera has a large so-called full-frame sensor, and the other has a sensor that is a bit less than half the size of the full-frame sensor, called an APS-C sensor or crop sensor. A crop sensor is really just a sensor that is smaller than a full-frame sensor. I'll tell you right now that personally, I very much like the APS-C sensor size. I see it as an intelligent compromise between the pros and cons of a larger sensor and the pros and cons of a smaller sensor. The same thing goes for another crop sensor that is called a micro four thirds sensor, which is about a quarter of the size of a full-frame sensor and is half the diagonal size of a full-frame sensor. It's important to note that when we are comparing a crop sensor camera to a full-frame one, as we'll see later, knowing that sort of comparative diagonal size is important. For those of you who are familiar with photographic film, or motion picture film for that matter, let me tell you first that the so-called full-frame sensor is also called a 35mm sensor, as its active imaging area is the same size as a 36 by 24mm frame from a 35mm wide film strip of what has for a long time now been called 35mm film. The APS-C format by comparison approximates the size of classic APS film. This is also a size that approximates the common frame size of motion picture film that has been used to make major motion pictures, which is called 35mm motion picture film, but is not to be confused with the 35mm photographic film I just mentioned. That uses a larger frame. It just goes to show you that you do not need a sensor as large as a full frame to make a major motion picture. The size of a sensor you might get from a consumer camera could actually do these days. You know, it wasn't so long ago when that seemed like an impossible dream. and the image quality of low-budget filmmaking suffered from the very small size of a video camera sensor, amongst other things. Even the Micro Four Thirds sensor that is considered small amongst photographers was a giant compared to what video cameras often used. By comparison to the APS-C size, Micro Four Thirds is just a bit smaller. It closely compares to the size of 110 cartridge film, and is a bit larger than 16mm motion picture film. I recall that decades after the original Star Trek TV show aired, which was shot on a format of 35mm motion picture film that was compatible with the 4:3 aspect ratio for television, I longed for a video camera that could render as good-looking of images that could be displayed on a television. I finally felt that I had bought one about a decade ago that captured high-definition video, but perhaps more importantly had a larger sensor than anything I had used before for recording video. And that was a Micro Four Thirds sensor. So, getting back to the video I promised to show you, let me show you first a freeze frame of the video. At one point in the video, its host, Duncan Dimanche, puts a little bit of math on the screen and talks about what sort of lens that he would need to use on a full-frame sensor for that lens to be equivalent, at least in some important ways, to an inexpensive 50mm f1.1 lens that he uses on an APS-C crop sensor. Don't worry if you are not familiar enough with camera lenses to know what those two numbers mean. My presentation should help. I will say, though, that the f1.1 number is very impressive for an inexpensive lens, and would even be for an expensive one. The math that Duncan puts up on the screen has to do with the full frame equivalency I mentioned. What he does is he takes a number, 1.5, which is basically an expression of how large the diagonal size of the crop sensor is in relation to the diagonal size of a full frame sensor, and multiplies that 1.5 number by both the focal length and the f-stop. As we'll see later, that's a smart thing to do. Indeed, that number 1.5 is what some of you keeners might know to be called a crop factor. Now, here's the video.
I want to show you, I have an 85mm here and a 50mm here, 1.1, this is a 1.4. It's a $5,000 setup versus a $1,500, $600 setup right here. And I want to show you guys that it's really hard to tell from full frame sensor to a crop sensor. And I promise you that a lot of you will not be able to tell the difference, because even I got confused at some point in Lightroom when I was retouching the two, and I actually thought I was retouching the Camlan 50mm when I was actually retouching the Sony's. And I truly believe that it's going to be really hard for you guys to tell the difference. All right, so I just want to talk about a little setup that I have here. It's a Camlan 50mm 1.1, which costs $160. It's a lens for the crop sensor, so it doesn't work on the full frame without having huge vignetting. And I want to compare it to the $1,800 Sony 85mm 1.4 and on the A7R II setup. So the 50mm is the equivalent of a 75mm 1.6 in terms of depth of field and bokeh and all that stuff. And here I have the 85 1.4, so we should be close in terms of bokeh. So I just want to concentrate on the rendering of the image rather than just the contrast and the sharpness, because obviously the 85 1.4 Sony is going to destroy it, no doubt about that. But I like the fact that this lens cost only $160. It's an amazing setup, so let's see what we got. All right, so we're going to start off with this shot that I took of Serge, and here's the first shot and here's the second shot. And can you tell which one is which? Here's the first one again, it's the same photo. And that's the other lens and the other setup. And when they're side by side, you should be able to tell the difference. It will be easier, of course, because you can tell that one is more blurry, the bokeh is more creamy. And here's the zoom at 200%. And let's look at the bokeh in the back. And both are shot at the widest aperture. So here you have it, the full frame was number 1 and the crop sensor was number 2. Alright, so the same shot but further back. Here's the first photo and the second photo. And now side by side. All right, so the crop was the left one and the full frame was the right one. But now you should know which one is which, because you do get used to the bokeh of each lens. I know that the 50mm cam lens has a very swirly bokeh and not as pleasing. It's a bit more busy, as we say. And the 85 Sony on the full frame is just super smooth and very creamy. Before I end off, I want to tell you why I made this video. I read a lot of comments on internet, on YouTube and so on. People keep saying, I want a full frame because I like the look of the full frame and so on. And that's a good reason. Yes, it's a lot easier to get a nice bokeh, nice creamy bokeh with a full frame sensor. But there are a lot of new lenses that are coming out that do crazy apertures like 1.1 or 0.95 that can really do amazing bokeh. And look at the size difference, guys. This is the full frame sensor, this is a crop sensor, and they're pretty much equivalent in terms of, you know, focal length and aperture. But this one costs about $1,800. This one costs $160. It's fully manual, no autofocus. And I will make a review of this lens very soon, and I will compare it to this one. And because frankly, I was very surprised by how good and how sharp it is for 1.1 lens. So let not be the bokeh your only argument for getting a full frame camera. You can get amazing photo with a crop sensor like the A6500 that I have. I love it. It's got a great dynamic range, it's got great video autofocus, great video quality. So yeah.
That was interesting, wasn't it? I think we can agree that in that video, the less expensive camera with a smaller sensor in some very important ways worked nearly as well as the more expensive camera with a larger sensor. I can tell you that the less expensive camera could have in some ways worked even better than the more expensive camera, such as rendering the background more out of focus in a situation where that more expensive camera used a different lens that was not as good as the expensive lens Duncan used on it. In that case, the overall camera and lens system with the smaller sensor could have still been a fair bit less expensive than the other system. My point is that it can be hard to justify the typical extra expense of a camera body with the very large full-frame sensor, even though that is a popular type of camera for professional photographers. And it can be hard to justify the extra expense in bulk for the kind of lens you might use on that camera, compared to more economical options. Sometimes you can get something that is close enough, as they say, and save money and even avoid bulk. It might not always be easy to get an inexpensive lens that renders the nice quality of background blur or bokeh that you might want. But in terms of just how much out of focus we can render the background and how much we can mitigate unsightly grain, you can get decent results with a crop sensor. Enough so that it might match or even surpass what a full-frame camera, even one with a decent lens, might do. So getting back to basics, how much do you know about technical camera-related terms like focal length? Do you know what depth of field is and exactly how to control it using the settings on your lens, like focus, f-stop, and focal length? For those who already know a lot, maybe you'll still get something from my take on things, but I won't be offended if you take this opportunity to take a break. Some technical camera-related terms made simple. Image plane and image circle. It could be tiresome if throughout my presentation I kept saying the phrase, the film frame or the sensor. I could instead talk about the plane that is there. Many people call this the focal plane or the plane of focus. But many people use the term focal plane to describe the flat area in a scene outside of the camera where things would optically be most in focus, which is sort of related to the other plane, but still these are two different planes. I'd agree with you if you found this situation to be kind of frustrating and stupid. Perhaps also kind of stupid is the fact that, depending on which of the two planes you are talking about, what you have is not so much in the shape of a plane as maybe something that used to be that shape, but then got melted in the sun and curved a bit. Maybe it even has some ripples in it like you'd see on the surface of a pond disturbed by you throwing a pebble into it. In any case, there is usually some field curvature involved with the plane outside the camera, although some of the greatest lenses out there minimize that significantly. There is an alternative term that I like for referring to the plane inside the camera, which applies equally well to film and digital cameras, and that term is the image plane. For digital cameras, we could use the term sensor plane, but really just the word sensor would be fine in that case. When I talk of focus distance, technically I am talking about the distance from the image plane inside the camera to the plane of focus outside of the camera. Often a camera will even have a marking to indicate where the image plane is, in case you really do want to bring some measuring tape out. Just one last quick note. Every lens projects what we call an image circle onto the image plane. And ideally, you would want the film frame or sensor to fall within that image circle. Stop. You may or may not know that a so-called stop in photography is basically a doubling or halving of an amount of light. You know, the light that we're letting into the camera, or the light that's lighting a scene. Angle of coverage and angle of view. A lens basically captures a part of a scene in front of it that you might imagine to be a cone that is at a particular angle that we can call the angle of coverage. The image circle then would have the same angle of coverage, spanning its diameter. By contrast, the rectangular image that of course results from the rectangular film frame or sensor share the same diagonal angle of view, which we can call more simply the angle of view. The two terms we've established now, angle of coverage and angle of view, are a convenient short form for what otherwise might respectively be painfully described as the angle of the conical field of the lens or the diagonal angle of the pyramidal field of the image. The angle of view, as measured in degrees, may or may not be the same as the angle of coverage. The angle of view will be the same as the angle of coverage if the corners of the frame or sensor touch the edge of the image circle. It's very important to note that we might have a sensor that falls short of doing that, in which case, as hopefully you can imagine, the angle of view is less than the angle of coverage. You might also have a digital camera with a sensor that does touch the edge of the image circle, but that also has what is called a crop mode, which basically uses only a central rectangular part of the sensor, or a crop of that sensor, if you will, so effectively that works like a smaller sensor. In any of these cases, the angle of view is based on the final image we get, and is dependent on the angle of coverage of the lens. Note that switching a camera into a crop mode, as you might imagine, has the effect of cropping in and zooming in to the image. Of course, one can use computer software instead to crop an image post-capture. Some people use the term angle of view interchangeably with the term field of view, and sometimes interchangeably with the term composition. It's been debated as to whether or not all these things should be considered to be the same thing. And until recently, I had not made up my own mind on this. I've decided after seeing how experts view the matter that these are not all the same things. I think what you have to consider is that we might want to achieve a particular framing of, say, a human subject, such as, for instance, a head and shoulders framing. The subject takes up a certain size of the frame. You might find that for a certain size of person sitting at a certain distance away from the camera, a lens that provides a certain angle of view works quite well for the particular head and shoulders framing that you want. If the distance between the camera and the person then changed, that would change the framing. We might, however, have a zoom lens that allows us to change our angle of view back to the original framing. In this context of using the word framing, I think we could use the word composition and probably the term field of view interchangeably with the word framing, but not with the term angle of view. Thus, I think it's possible that for one field of view, you could have more than one angle of view that accomplishes that. However, if I tell you that I think that specifically a 30-degree angle of view works well for a portrait composition, as long as it is not too tight, I'm taking into account that the subject should be roughly within a certain range of distance to the camera, like maybe 6 feet, so as to not look as if that subject is too close to the camera or too far. Of course, what constitutes being too close is a bit of a subjective matter, but there is something called perspective distortion, which I won't get much into here, but let me say that if you push things too far either way, with being wide or narrow in angle, you might run into some obvious trouble. So, you can likely imagine that some angles of view seem to work better than others for certain types of compositions. An angle of view that likely looks the most normal to us is one that matches or nearly matches the angle of coverage of the human eye. The human eye achieves about 55 degrees of coverage. So you could exactly, or at least nearly match that if you liked, with what is called a normal lens. Such a lens might achieve that 55-degree angle, or an angle that does not deviate too far from it. Diverting quite a bit from the 55-degree angle introduces what we might call perspective distortion. For instance, if you go too much wider than 55 degrees, things can look a little too wide, as we have with the fisheye effect. Or if you go too much narrower than 55 degrees, you might notice things looking odd in a different way, with possibly a human face looking too wide, or the background of a subject being highly magnified and perhaps looking closer to the subject than it actually is. Sometimes we might prefer the look of perspective distortion when using a telephoto lens for doing portraiture work. Recall earlier that we accomplished the same framing of a person at 1.8 meters focus distance using an 85mm lens, and at 2.5 meters focus distance using a 118 focal length. Flipping back and forth between these computer-simulated photos, does the background look more blurry to you in one photo than another? In both cases, we are using f1.8 lenses, and given the difference in focus distance, technically both backgrounds are equally out of focus. Also, if you understand depth of field, I can tell you now that the depth of field, or basically what's actually in focus, is exactly the same in both photos at a mere 4.5 centimeters where the model is. But depth of field is not the only thing that dictates the amount of background blur. You would likely agree that the background looks more blurry in this photo using the 118 focal length. This is thanks to the perspective distortion basically magnifying the out-of-focus background. You likely notice that angle of view is tied in quite closely with this thing that I've been calling focal length, which I have not really covered yet. I nevertheless showed you that we can use two different focal lengths to create the same shot compositionally, and with the highest focal length giving us the most magnified and thus most blurry looking background. I could also tell you that the blurry bits in both backgrounds look equally blurry despite the apparent difference, but you don't have to take just my word for it. Let's wrap up this part of the video before the break by giving the last and very short word on this matter to YouTube photo educator Gerald Undone. And then after the break, the first thing my video will do is address any of you who don't quite understand things like focal length, f-stop, and depth of field just yet.
Whenever you use a lens with a longer focal length, those background bits always seem larger and more creamier, which makes people think that their focal length is what's affecting their depth of field. But again, this is just an illusion because longer lenses make things appear closer, including the blurry bits in the background. Now, I'm not suggesting there's no difference between focal lengths because longer focal lengths can definitely give you a more pleasing bokeh or better separation from the background, which can be sought after when it comes to portraits. But if we took that same photo with a wider lens and then just zoomed in on the background, we would see that those background bits are actually equally sharp or equally out of focus, regardless of what focal length that you were using, which means the depth of field wasn't altered, just the magnification of the out of focus parts.